Ready for the fun? Now the fun begins. Now, I mentioned this way back at the beginning of the semester, but I'm going to remind you that I am by training a parasite biologist. So my learning was centered on weird little creatures that get into bigger creatures and mess with them. And it applies to things like, little animals and big animals, but stuff like bacteria and viruses all, a lot of the functions are similar enough that diseases, man. But parasites are a lot more entertaining than viruses or bacteria. So I've got a lot of stories to tell you as we go along. The first group of animals that we're going to look at are not technically animals, as in not in kingdom Animalia. They are protists. But we're not going to look at the whole kingdom of protists. We're just going to look at the animal-like protists, sort of. The reason that the Protista were given a kingdom unto themselves and split off from the other ones is that they don't behave. Is that you have ones that have animal-like functions and plant-like functions, or plant-like functions and fungus-like functions, or fungus-like functions and animal-like functions. And to classify them in the plant-animal-fungus kingdom was just such a pain in the butt that things were classified in multiple places, and finally I think everybody just rose up and went, why don't you guys go play in your own groups and leave us big kingdom people alone? So you wind up with the Protist Kingdom, and the things that have a primarily animalistic leaning are in what's called the Protozoa. These guys all have the same name card on it with different names. It says Amoeba Conventions. Now, amoebas are in a subgroup of the Protozoa that very, very rarely reproduce any way other than asexually. So the underlying joke is these guys would all be genetically identical to one another. They'd all be identical twins. But we give identical twins different names. So unlike bacteria or viruses, these guys have cells similar to our cells. They're good-sized cells with a nucleus and all sorts of doodads in them. Eukaryotes, remember eukaryotes? But these are single-celled. Some of them can cluster together as colonies. Remember colonial organisms where they get together and they, in this case, if they're single-cell colonials, they kind of start behaving like a multi-celled system. But they can live independent of one another if they absolutely positively have to, which is another thing about being colonial, is the individuals can live on their own, they just don't like to. And when they do get together, they don't just hang out together, they start to do different jobs to support the whole group. Now being single-celled, anything that is an active cell needs to be able to get stuff into the cell, he said gesturing outwardly, into the cell and out of the cell, which means you need liquid in the cell, which it has, right? Cells are full of liquid water-based juices. But you also need liquid on the other side of the membrane to be able to move stuff in and out. So any active cell is only going to be active in wet surroundings. Now that could be in water, it could be inside the tissues of another living thing, plants, animals, funguses, whatever. It could be in a drop of water out in out in the wide world. But for these things to get around, they typically, if they have to get it somewhere from one body of water to another, a lot of stuff lives in the water and it doesn't need to worry about that. But a lot of them have casings that they can put themselves in that will survive travel from one watery source to another watery source where there's no water in between. And that keeps them from drying out and dying, which is, not good for them. That's a very odd noise coming from outside. So we're going to look at 4 major subgroups of the Protozoa. Two of them kind of overlap. They're often combined into a single subgroup. The first two, the amoebas and the flagellates, technically the sarcodines and the mastigopherans. How you like that for a name? And they're often in a super kingdom or supergroup called the Sarcomastigophora. We're going to consider them as separate groups. And we're going to start with the amoebas. This is an amoeba that's been preserved in a very fancy way and then taken a picture of in a scanning electron microscope where you can scan the surface of it and get some of the surface features, and it's a lot bumpier than you would expect it to be. But these projections that stick out of the cell, that stuck out of the cartoon amoebas, are pseudopods. They're, in the case of a classic amoeba, they're fairly thick. And what happens is you pick these guys up and move them. Floating free, they tend to round up. And then you drop them on a surface and they settle on the surface. And they start to taste their surroundings. They have receptors on the outside of the membrane. Oh, what's over here? What's over here? And if something over here seems good, or something over here seems bad, what will happen is you'll see flow inside the cell and it will push one of these things out. And they continue to taste in that direction. And if they continue to like what's out there, the whole rest of the cell just flows into that until eventually the whole cell's over here. And then maybe it goes this way and it flows into it and the cell's over there. Maybe it starts to not like the taste over there, but likes over it. So they crawl. You put them on a surface, they crawl along. And whoever looked at these under a microscope went, so they're kind of crawling. It's like they're putting feet out and crawling, but they're not really feet because they're not built like feet. They don't quite act like feet, so they're only sort of feet. That's what this word means in Latin. Pseudopod means kind of fake feet. And this is a characteristic of the amoeba group. So here's your classic pseudopods. Some amoebas have funny little casings around them, and they use their pseudopods almost like they were tentacles, and they can walk along with things. Some of them have little shells. This wouldn't be a calcium shell like a snail would have, but it would look like a snail shell. And it puts these sticky nets out, and it catches stuff and pulls it in to consume it. It pulls it into the cell and digests it in the cell. And these guys are called radiolarians. They have these way more than is actually there. The hundreds and hundreds of these extensions that they do kind of act like tentacles. They can grab stuff and pull it in by that. But it mostly just spreads them out so that they're very buoyant, is that they tend to float in the water. Any kind of little movement of the water, they tend to stay up and not sink much. And they're not really swimmers, but they stay up in the water anyway. So there's a lot of other variations that pseudopods can be used for. Now the one that I had the electron micrograph of will come up when I talk about the next group. Even though it's in the amoeba group, it'll make sense in a couple of minutes. I'll come back and write some of this stuff down. Now the second group are called the flagellates. I'll write that down. And they have these long, thin projections that they can move. Most of you know that the end of a sperm, the tail of a sperm, is a flagellum. And that's a flagellum. It helps, it spins and it helps to push sperm along. That's very common in sperm. Not all sperm have that. Some of them crawl with pseudopods. But there's a lot of living protozoa that have flagella on them. And then the third group we're going to look at are the ciliates. And the ciliates have projections, but there are many, many more of them, and they're not as big. And we will give you a list of what makes flagella different from cilia when we kind of hit that bridge between those two groups. There's a lot of flagellates, and if we get a chance to do these in the lab, you'll get a chance to see flagellates that are green, and they photosynthesize. So they swim, but they also, and they eat stuff, and they also make glucose using light. And there's a lot of flagellates that are on this kind of threshold between plants and animals, some of them between animals and funguses. Many, many, many different types of species, one of which I want to talk about because you can get it around here. Giardia. Giardia is found actually all over the world. And as parasites go, it's a very unusual parasite in that it lives in digestive systems. Now think about this. Digestive systems is where you break your food down. Different animals eat very different types of food, and so the chemistry of their digestive systems tends to be pretty doggone different. Is that the chemistry of a cow's digestive system is really different than a mouse's digestive system, or a human's digestive system, or a pig's digestive system, or a mouse's digestive system. Giardia can actually live in all of those. Giardia can live in almost any kind of mammal, including people. This is where it becomes interesting. So this is a Giardia. This is a picture taken through a microscope, just a regular light microscope with a stain on the Giardia to make it show up. This is a drawing I made on here showing that this part is kind of recessed where these two nuclei are. Giardia have two nuclei. And they've got, decent number of flagella. And here's where you try to keep up with me writing down. So Giardia lives in a bunch of different animals, including a lot of wild animals. And what passes out the backside of the infected animal are cysts. They resist drying, so they can, they out, and they can sit there for a while without dying. If everything goes their way, it rains, it loosens all the stuff up, and the cysts go with the runoff and wind up in a stream. They often wind up in a pond, and they settle to the bottom of the pond to become, they kind of sit in the sediment. They can sit in the sediment and be alive for a long time. And typically when animals drink from a pond, even people when they go to get water out of a pond, they walk into the water and they drink, or they walk into the water and they pick stuff up in containers if they're people. Well, as soon as you stir the bottom up, the Giardia cysts come up into the water and you pick them up. And then you drink it with the water. This is why you don't want to drink water way out in the woods. That I remember before I learned about Giardia, I always figured I only had to worry about contamination from humans. And if you're way up in the Adirondacks that drink it out of a stream, you go, there's no humans upstream from me. I don't have to worry about this. Well, there are a lot of animals carrying Giardia. Giardia gets into you, comes out of the cysts, immediately starts to reproduce like crazy. Asexual reproduction. Lots and lots and lots and lots of Giardia. They cap onto little projections on the lining of your intestine. They resist being digested. They can live in a bunch of different chemicals of digestion. And your immune system starts to realize something bad's going on. There's something in there that doesn't belong. And the problem with your immune system is it can't get at them. A lot of things live in your digestive system. As long as they can not get digested, they're isolated from your immunity because you can't throw antibodies at them because you just digest those. You can't throw white blood cells, fighters at them because you just digest those. And so the best your immune system can do is try to push them the hell out. So it inflames the lining of your digestive system, which cramps you up, and everything gets pushed out faster. These guys are hanging on to the lining though. Some of them get pushed out, but they want to get pushed out. Is that the ones that are being pushed toward the end of your digestive system, they get into cysts, and this is how they spread, right? They get out the back end and hopefully onto the next host. In the meantime, you have what's often called beaver fever, technically called giardiasis. But when people first got here, you want to set up shop and build a village, you better have reliable water. So you're either going to set next to a big river, not a little stream, or if you're going up streams, you want a place where the water has settled into a big pool. You may be surprised to know there are very few natural bodies of water around here. Most of them are dammed, people dams at one end. That has kept the water built up. Or, when people first got here as colonists, beaver dams. So those were your ponds. That's where people kind of settled because there's a reliable body of water, and that's where they got water from, and then they got sick. Damn beavers. Beaver fever. It's carried by a lot of things other than beavers. In fact, I'm not even sure we know for sure that beavers even carry Giardia. They probably do. So you get sick. You get crampy, you get a fever, beaver fever, and you feel pretty lousy for a week to 10 days. Unless you have other sorts of problems, you're very young or you're very old or you're already sick with other things, it isn't going to do you that much damage. Chances are it's not going to really make you any sicker than you already are. And it does pass. Here's the interesting thing about it passing. It hasn't passed. You haven't gotten rid of them. But they have this explosive reproductive cycle. So if they can get out of your back end, you're probably still somewhere close to their descendants being able to get back into a body of water because you haven't gone very far. But then they just want to hang around and then, pass cysts occasionally and, maybe they spread, maybe they don't. But what'll happen is their population will drop down to a level where your immune system isn't concerned with them anymore. They're not getting a signal to your immune system, so the cramping goes away and the fever goes away. But they're still in there, and you're still passing cysts. They're in there at such a low level that unless you keep getting them in your drinking water, after maybe 3 years, you actually have lost them. That's not good. While they're in there at a low population, they keep new guys from giving you this explosive beaver fever effect. They go, oh, great, come join the party, but keep it low key. We're not bothering the host. And you don't have another bout of beaver fever. Is that you're not immune to it. Your little Giardia have become your buddies. They're protecting you from another nasty outbreak of beaver fever. And that's true until they've kind of passed out. So people have picked this up on camping trips. They go home, it's not in their drinking water, they're not replenishing their population. After 2-3 years, they could go out camping again, pick it up, and have another bout of beaver fever. Now remember I said I'd come back. There's an amoeba that works in a very similar way. The amoeba is found in Mexico and Central America and the top of South America. And what do they tell you when you go vacationing in those places? Don't drink the water. There's an amoeba. It's a little nastier than Giardia. It can make you sicker. It actually, in some people who are relatively healthy, still can be life-threatening. That's unusual. Usually it's just a really nasty bout of, cramps and diarrhea. And, you push everything through really fast. You can't get the water out of it, so you get diarrhea from that. But it's an amoeba. But it does the same thing. And the locals, the reason the locals can drink the water is their native population, their buddies, have set up to protect them from a further outbreak. Whereas you, coming in new, don't have that protection. So you have two different parasites from two different groups that are acting in very, very similar ways. Unfortunately, the amoeba, you're not gonna like this if you're going on vacation to Mexico, and there's a problem with this. It has to pass from human to human. So if you pick it up from the drinking water, it's because that drinking water was contaminated, not with animals, but with human wastes, it still happens in a lot of places in, the middle Americas. Okay, as I mentioned, the amoebas and the flagellates are often combined into one group. The amoebas, the flagellates that we look at in the lab, if you leave them on the slide too long and they get a little annoyed, they'll actually settle on the glass and start to crawl. They'll form pseudopods that weren't there before. And some amoebas can generate flagella and swim away from certain conditions that are not good for them. So there's some crossover between the amoebas and the flagellates, and that's why they've combined them into one group. Then you've got the ciliates. Is that the next one? Well, I'm going to put it here. Ciliates are kind of the very top of the line of what you can do with a cell and still have it just be a single cell. They do a lot of very, very fancy things. So much so that they have two different types of nuclei. They have a nucleus. Now your nucleus is your code to do stuff, right? You need to make proteins. The proteins are going to do stuff in your cells. You need to get codes for them, make the proteins, have them do the stuff. Your macronucleus is, you need a protein, that's where you ask. You go, give us the codes are in there. It's kind of the day-to-day working nucleus. But those codes need to be copied effectively. Anytime you're going to reproduce, you need to make copies and distribute the copies. And that's what the micronucleus is for. The micronucleus is like the master copy. If you need another macronucleus, you can actually divide a micronucleus, hang on to one of them that's going to keep being your master copy, and the other one will change into a macronucleus, and then you can start working it. Because these things do wear out after a while. But this is the only group that's got these two specialized types of nuclei. I think rather than try and squeeze in the difference between flagella and cilia here, the other group isn't going to take that long anyway. We'll stop here and throw the rest on another video.